Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. Night fell over Manhattan like a black velvet cloak sprinkled with golden lights. The Waldorf Regency Hotel stood imposingly on Park Avenue, its windows gleaming like jewels against the darkening sky. Inside the gala hall, the air was heavy with the scent of white lilies, French champagne, and ambition disguised as elegance. Women in haute couture gowns glided across the marble floor, while men in tuxedos exchanged firm handshakes and calculated smiles. Elena Hart didn't want to be there. She adjusted the thin strap of her black dress, simple but flawless, and watched the crowd with attentive eyes. A Columbia graduate with an MBA completed at 26, Elena had built her life on two pillars: intelligence and independence. She didn't belong to this world of facades and falsehoods, but when her father called with that trembling, desperate voice, she had no choice. "Elena, I need you just this once, please." She knew just this once was a lie. It always had been. Elena took a deep breath, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. The hall was packed, but she felt alone. Her father, Robert Hart, was somewhere among the guests, probably drinking more than he should, and making desperate contacts to try to get out of yet another financial mess. Gambling. Always gambling. She grabbed a champagne flute from a passing tray, more to have something in her hands than out of any desire to drink. The golden liquid bubbled gently, reflecting the crystal chandelier lights above. Elena took a small sip and felt the subtle bitterness on her tongue. "Elena Hart," the voice came from behind her, deep, controlled, with a natural authority that made her spine straighten instinctively. She turned around and met the coldest eyes she'd ever seen. James Whittaker stood less than a meter away, hands in the pockets of a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders, and a posture that suggested power without needing to demonstrate it. His dark hair was combed back, revealing an angular face, defined jawline, and metallic gray eyes that seemed to pierce through any defense. Elena knew the name. Everyone did. James Whittaker was the billionaire who had transformed a family real estate company into a global empire. Whittaker Industries controlled hotels, technology, investments. He was feared in boardrooms and respected in the highest circles of power. At 34, he was one of the richest and most impenetrable men in the country. "Yes," Elena replied, lifting her chin. "And you, James Whittaker?" "I am." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with disturbing intensity. "We need to talk." It wasn't a request. Elena felt a shiver run down her spine, but kept her expression neutral. "About what?" "Your father." The two words fell like stones in her stomach. Elena gripped the glass tighter, feeling the cold crystal against her palm. What did he do this time? James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he made a subtle gesture with his head toward a side door away from the crowd. Elena hesitated, but knew she had no choice. She placed the glass on a nearby table and followed him. They crossed the hall and entered a more discreet corridor lit by bronze sconces. James opened the door to a private room, a luxurious office with mahogany shelves, a glass desk, and a panoramic view of the city. He closed the door behind them, and the muffled sound of the party disappeared, replaced by a dense silence. Elena crossed her arms, keeping her distance. "So, what does my father owe you?" James walked to the desk and leaned slightly against the edge. Arms crossed. His eyes never left hers for a second. $3 million. Elena felt her blood run cold. 3? She swallowed hard, trying to process the number. How? Illegal gambling. He lost big several times, tried to recover his losses by betting even more. James's voice was devoid of emotion, but each word fell like an axe. When he couldn't pay, he offered shares in a bankrupt company as collateral, shares he knew were worthless. Elena closed her eyes for a second, feeling shame burn her cheeks. Of course he would do that. "And what do you want from me to pay?" "You don't have $3 million, Miss Hart." James uncrossed his arms and took a step toward her. "But I have a proposal." Something about the way he said proposal made her stomach turn. "What kind of proposal?" He pulled an envelope from his jacket's inner pocket and placed it on the glass table. The paper was thick, expensive, with the Whittaker Industries logo embossed on it. "A contract. You marry me." Elena blinked, certain she'd heard wrong. "I'm sorry, what?" "Marriage. 1-year duration. Renewable as needed. In exchange, your father's debt is forgiven, and you receive generous financial compensation at the end of the contract." She let out a dry, incredulous laugh. "Are you serious?" "Completely." Elena shook her head, taking a step back. "This is insane. Why on earth would you need a contract marriage?" James didn't look away. "Image concerns." International investors prefer leaders who demonstrate personal stability. I need a wife. You need your father's debt to disappear. It's a simple transaction. Simple. Elena crossed her arms tightly. You're talking about marriage like it's a corporate merger deal. Because it is. She rolled her eyes and turned to leave. But his voice stopped her. There's one more clause. Elena stopped, hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. Clause number 7. James continued. His voice still controlled, but with a new weight. Physical intimacy before marriage. The air left her lungs. Elena spun on her heels, facing him with fury. You're asking me to sleep with you as part of a contract. I'm establishing the terms. Compatibility is important. Compatibility? Elena gave a bitter laugh. You mean control? James shrugged, impassive. Call it what you want. Those are the terms. Elena felt ångerboil in her veins. She stepped forward until she was inches away from him, looking directly into his cold eyes. I'm not a commodity you can buy, Mr. Whitaker. And if you think you can force me into this because of the debt of a man I barely know anymore, you're very wrong. James didn't back down. In fact, he tilted his head slightly, studying her with something that looked like curiosity. So, what do you propose? Elena blinked, surprised by the opening. What? You clearly don't like my terms. So, negotiate. She hesitated, her brain working quickly. This was an opportunity, an opening, and Elena Hart hadn't gotten where she was by being passive. She stepped back, regaining her composure. All right. Here are my terms. Complete debt forgiveness. Not just suspension, full and documented forgiveness. An executive position at Whitaker Industries with market salary and real autonomy. A prenuptial agreement that protects my assets. And Clause 7. Removed. James raised an eyebrow. Removed completely. Elena crossed her arms. Instead, 3 weeks of real dates, dinners, conversations, time together to test emotional compatibility. And if there's genuine chemistry, physical too, but by mutual choice, not by contract, the silence stretched between them. Charged with tension, James watched her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. Finally, he extended his hand. 3 weeks. But if at the end you decide there's no compatibility, the debt is still forgiven. That's my only non-negotiable term. Elena looked at the outstretched hand, strong, firm. She knew she was making a deal with the devil, but maybe, just maybe, she could control the fire. She shook his hand and felt the spark. The 3 days following the event at the Waldorf Regency were the most tense of Elena's life. She could barely sleep, replaying every word of her conversation with James Whitaker, analyzing every detail of the deal she had proposed. The audacity of what she'd done only truly hit her when she woke up the next morning with sunlight streaming through the gaps in the curtains of her small Brooklyn apartment, and realized she had negotiated her own terms with one of the most powerful men in the country, and he had accepted. On Wednesday morning, a courier delivered a thick, cream-colored envelope with the Whitaker Industries logo inside a revised contract meticulously drafted, each clause adjusted as she had demanded. The handwriting was firm, almost aggressive, but the terms were all there. Complete debt forgiveness, executive position, prenuptial agreement. And the removal of Clause 7, in its place, a new section titled Mutual Evaluation Period, 21 days. Elena spent hours reading every line, every word, looking for hidden traps. She found none. James Whitaker apparently was a man of his word, or a brilliant strategist who knew when to retreat to win later. On Friday afternoon, she sat in a conference room on the 43rd floor of Whitaker Tower, in the heart of Midtown. The glass table reflected the city lights below, and through the panoramic windows, Manhattan stretched out like a vertical chessboard, towers of steel, glass, and ambition. On the other side of the table, sitting with the impeccable posture of someone born to lead, was James. He wore a dark gray suit that seemed to have been tailored directly onto his body, and his eyes, those penetrating gray eyes, were fixed on her with an intensity that made the air feel thinner. Beside him, his lawyer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and gold-rimmed glasses, was leafing through a copy of the contract. Elena had brought her own lawyer, Liam Wong, a college friend who worked in corporate law, and who nearly fell out of his chair when she explained the situation. Everything seems to be in order, Liam said quietly, leaning towards Elena. The terms are clear, no obscure clauses. It's surprisingly fair. Elena nodded, but didn't take her eyes off James. So, we're ready to sign? Asked James's lawyer, adjusting his glasses. No, Elena replied, and the word fell into the room like a silent bomb. James raised an eyebrow, the only sign of surprise on his impassive face. No, Elena opened the folder she had brought and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She slid it across the table toward James. There are a few more things we need to clarify before I sign anything. James picked up the paper and unfolded it, his eyes scanning the lines. The lawyer beside him craned his neck to read as well. But James raised a hand, stopping him. He read in silence, and Elena watched every micro-expression, the way his eyes narrowed slightly, how the corner of his mouth twitched almost imperceptibly. When he finished, he looked up. You want complete autonomy in the executive position. No direct supervision from me. Exactly, Elena replied, keeping her voice steady. If I'm going to work at Whitaker Industries, I need the freedom to make strategic decisions without interference. Otherwise, it's just a token position, and I won't accept that. James leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced on the table. And if your decisions negatively impact the company, then you fire me like you would any other executive. Elena crossed her legs, maintaining her upright posture. But I'm not going to be a porcelain doll in an office just to make you look generous. Either I have real power, or I have nothing. Silence settled in. James's lawyer looked uncomfortable, shuffling the papers in front of him. Liam, beside Elena, remained motionless, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. James studied Elena for long seconds. She didn't look away, didn't blink, didn't back down. Finally, he nodded. Agreed. His lawyer nearly choked. Mr. Whitaker, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. Agreed, James repeated, his voice cutting. He turned to the lawyer. Revise the contract and add the clause. Complete executive autonomy, subject only to quarterly performance review. The lawyer opened his mouth, hesitated, and then closed it again, nodding silently. Elena felt a wave of satisfaction, but didn't let it show. She pointed to the second item on the list. Prenuptial agreement. I want an additional clause. If the marriage ends on your initiative, I receive compensation of $5 million in addition to the forgiven debt. If it ends on my initiative, I waive any compensation beyond the debt forgiveness. James frowned. You're incentivizing me not to end the agreement. I'm protecting myself. Elena corrected. If you decide I'm not convenient after dragging me into this arrangement, I want guarantees that I won't walk away empty-handed. But if I decide I don't want to continue, I won't extort you. It's fair. James drummed his fingers on the table, thoughtful. Elena could see the calculations happening behind those gray eyes. Risks, benefits, probabilities. $5 million, he murmured. More to himself. Then he looked up. 3, 4.5, 3.5. And that's my final offer. Elena took a deep breath. It wasn't what she wanted, but it was more than she expected to get. Agreed. James gestured to the lawyer, who began scribbling furiously. Anything else? James asked, and there was an almost amused tone in his voice. Now Elena leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Yes, the 3 weeks of dates. I choose half of them. You choose the other half. No corporate dinners or business events disguised as dates. Real time. Real conversations. James tilted his head, considering. You want to really get to know me. If I'm going to marry you, even if it's an arrangement, I need to know who I'm dealing with. Elena kept her tone professional, but there was a current of something more beneath the surface. And you need to know who I am beyond the daughter of an indebted gambler. For the first time since they'd entered the room, James smiled. It was a small smile, almost imperceptible, but it was there, touching the corners of his lips in a way that transformed his entire face. For a brief moment, he looked human. Fair, he said, half each. But I choose the first one. Elena raised an eyebrow. Why? Because I want you to see that I'm taking this seriously. There was something about the way he said it, the unexpected sincerity in his voice that made Elena's heart skip a beat. She forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. All right, you choose the first one. James extended his hand across the table. So, do we have a deal? Elena looked at his hand. Long fingers, broad palm, unwavering confidence. She knew that shaking that hand meant entering completely unknown territory. It meant taking a risk. It meant trusting even partially a man she barely knew. But it also meant saving her father from total ruin. It meant a position of power at one of the largest companies in the world. It meant perhaps the chance to prove herself at a level she never imagined possible. She extended her hand and shook his. His skin was warm, warmer than she expected, and the grip was firm but not aggressive, confident, without being arrogant. For a second longer than necessary, they stayed like that, hands joined, eyes fixed on each other. And then James released her, leaning back in his chair with that same controlled expression. My lawyers will finalize the contract by Monday. You can review it and sign. He paused. And our first date is tomorrow night at 7. Wear something comfortable. Elena frowned. Comfortable? You'll see. He stood up, buttoning his jacket with a fluid movement. His lawyer hurried to gather the papers, but James was already turning to leave. At the door, he stopped and looked back. Only at Elena. For someone being forced into an agreement, you negotiate like you hold all the cards. Elena smiled, tilting her head slightly. Maybe because I do. James smiled back, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes and made them shine like liquid mercury. Until tomorrow, Miss Hart, and then he left, leaving behind only the faint scent of cedar and something indefinable, something that made Elena's stomach knot. Liam let out a long sigh beside her. You just negotiated with James Whittaker and won. I don't know if you're brave or crazy. Elena kept looking at the closed door, maybe a little of both, but deep down, as she gathered her papers and prepared to leave, a single question hammered in her mind. What the hell is he planning for tomorrow? Elena spent all of Saturday trying to guess what James Whittaker considered a comfortable date. She imagined expensive restaurants with strict dress codes, charity events, disguised as intimate dinners, or perhaps even a private flight to some exclusive location. Everything seemed possible when it came to a billionaire accustomed to having the world at his feet. At 6:30 the evening, she stood in front of her bedroom mirror, wearing dark jeans, a white linen blouse, and a brown leather jacket she'd bought on clearance years ago. Simple, comfortable, but still elegant enough not to look sloppy. Her brown hair fell loose over her shoulders in natural waves, and she applied just a touch of lip gloss and mascara. Nothing extravagant. The intercom buzzed exactly at 7. Elena grabbed her purse and walked down the 3 flights of stairs in her elevatorless building. When she pushed open the front door, the cool spring evening air touched her face, bringing with it the smell of wet asphalt and flowers from nearby planters. And there, standing next to a discreet black Tesla, not the limousine she'd half expected, was James Whittaker. He was wearing jeans, dark jeans, a gray button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and white sneakers that looked new but not ostentatious. No tie, no suit. Without the corporate armor he wore like a second skin. He looked normal, dangerously attractive, but normal. James smiled when he saw her. A small, genuine smile that made something strange happen in her chest. Punctual, he said, opening the passenger door. Always, Elena replied. Sliding into the car, the interior smelled of new leather and the same cedar scent she'd noticed in the conference room. James got in on the driver's side, and for a moment, the space felt smaller, more intimate. She could feel his warmth, even without touching him. So, Elena began, adjusting her seatbelt. Where are we going? Some exclusive club dinner in a skyscraper. James started the car, the engine purring softly. Better. And he said nothing more. They drove through Brooklyn as the sun set, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. Elena watched through the window, trying to figure out the route, but James drove with the confidence of someone who knew every street. Finally, he parked near Brooklyn Bridge Park in a quieter area, away from the busier tourist spots. When they got out of the car, Elena looked around, confused. A park? James locked the car and turned to her, hands in his pockets. You wanted something real. So, here we are. Something real. He started walking, and Elena followed. Still processing. They walked along a small paved path until they reached an open area where food trucks were parked, lit by colorful LED lights and lanterns hanging from wires. The smell of food burgers on the griddle, French fries, seasoned tacos, pizza dough baking floated in the air like a warm invitation. There were people everywhere. Families with children, young couples, groups of friends laughing loudly. Music played from somewhere, smooth jazz mixed with the buzz of conversations. It was vibrant, alive, human. Elena stopped, looking around with a mixture of surprise and something that felt dangerously close to admiration. You brought me to food trucks, James shrugged. But there was an amused gleam in his eyes. I did my research. Saw that you usually order from a Mexican food truck near your work. Thought you might like variety. Elena blinked, processing that. You researched me? Of course. He spoke as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. If I'm going to spend 3 weeks getting to know you, I figured I'd better start with an advantage. There was something strangely thoughtful about that, even if invasive. Elena didn't know whether to be annoyed or touched. That's kind of stalkerish, you know. James smiled. I prefer to call it due diligence. She rolled her eyes, but couldn't hold back the smile that formed on her lips. All right, mister. Due diligence. Where's the food? They approached a food truck specializing in gourmet tacos. The vendor, A middle-aged Latino man with a stained apron and a wide smile greeted them in Spanish before switching to English. "What do you have today, friends?" James looked at Elena. "You choose." Elena ordered carnitas tacos with guacamole, and James ordered the same, adding an order of churros to share. While they waited, he bought 2 cold craft beers from a nearby cooler and handed one to her. They found a wooden bench near the water with a view of the Brooklyn Bridge lit up against the night sky. The city sparkled on the other side of the river like a diamond necklace. The sound of waves gently lapping against the pier, mixed with distant music and laughter around them. Elena took a bite of her taco and closed her eyes for a moment, savoring it. When she opened them again, James was watching her. "What?" she asked, wiping her mouth with a napkin. "Nothing." He took a sip of his beer. "Just, you look different when you're happy." Elena felt her face warm. "I wasn't unhappy before. No. But you were guarded. Now you're relaxed." He was right. She was relaxed. More than she'd been in days, maybe in weeks. "Why here?" Elena asked, gesturing around. "Of all the places you could have chosen. Why food trucks in a park?" James looked at the beer in his hands, slowly turning the bottle. "Because expensive places are easy. Anyone with money can book a table at a 5-star restaurant and impress with rare wines and tiny dishes that look more like art. But that doesn't say anything about who you are." He paused, raising his eyes to her. "I wanted to see you in a place where you didn't have to pretend." Elena felt something tighten in her chest. That was unexpected and dangerously real. "What about you?" she asked, tilting her head. "Are you pretending now?" James held her gaze for a long moment. "No." The word hung between them, weighted with something Elena didn't expect. She took another sip of beer, trying to calm the nerves that were suddenly on edge. "Then tell me something real," she said. "Something that's not in any corporate profile or magazine article." James rested his elbows on his knees, looking at the water. "My parents died when I was 12. Car accident. My grandmother raised me in a small apartment in Queens. She sewed clothes on the side to pay the bills." He paused, his voice getting lower. "I used to sit with her while she worked, listening to the sound of the sewing machine. She always said every stitch mattered, that if you didn't pay attention to the details, everything would fall apart." Elena felt a lump in her throat. "Is she still alive?" "No. She died 5 years ago, but I bought her a house in Long Island before that with a huge garden. She always wanted a garden. There was pain there beneath the controlled surface." Elena could see it in the way his shoulders tensed slightly, in the way he looked away. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. James nodded but didn't respond. Instead, he turned to her. "What about you? Tell me something real." Elena took a deep breath, looking at the city lights reflecting on the water. "My father wasn't always like this. When I was a kid, he was funny, caring. He'd take me to parks just like this one." She smiled sadly. "But after my mother died, he changed. Started drinking, gambling. It was like he was trying to fill a void he could never fill. And I tried to save him so many times I lost count until I realized I couldn't." James watched her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. "But you're still here, still trying to save him." "Because he's my father," Elena said, her voice tight. "Even when it shouldn't matter, it does." James reached out and, with a gentleness that surprised her, brushed a strand of hair that had fallen over her face, tucking it behind her ear. His thumb lightly grazed her cheek, and Elena felt her breath catch. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his voice low. Elena couldn't look away. There was something happening here. Something that went beyond the contract, beyond logic. It was chemical, magnetic, dangerous. Before either of them could say anything else, the sound of a saxophone cut through the air. They looked around and saw a street musician playing further ahead near a small paved area where some couples danced under the lantern lights. James stood up and extended his hand. "Dance with me." Elena looked at his hand, then at his face. Here in front of everyone, why not? There was a challenge in those gray eyes, and Elena never backed down from a challenge. She placed her hand in his and let him pull her up. They walked to the area where other couples danced, and James pulled her close, one hand on her waist, the other holding her hand firmly. They began to move slowly, following the smooth rhythm of the saxophone. Elena could feel the warmth of his body through his shirt, the scent of cedar mixed with something warm and masculine. Their faces were close. So close she could see the small darker flecks in his gray eyes like distant storms. "You dance well," she murmured. "My grandmother insisted on lessons," James replied, his lips almost touching her forehead. "Said a man who can't dance doesn't know how to treat a woman." Elena felt a shiver run down her spine. She was wise. She was. They continued dancing, and the world around them disappeared. There were no more food trucks, no people, no sound of the city. Just the two of them moving together under the stars that were beginning to appear in the night sky. When the music ended, they stopped, but didn't pull away. James looked at her with an expression Elena couldn't fully decipher, something between desire and confusion, as if he too was trying to understand what was happening between them. "Thank you," she said, her voice coming out huskier than she intended. "For what?" "For this, for surprising me." James smiled. That small, devastating smile that transformed his entire face. "The night's not over yet," and as they walked back to the car, hands almost touching, but never quite, Elena realized something terrifying. She was starting to like him, really like him, and that wasn't part of the plan. The following days unfolded like pages of a book Elena didn't know she was reading. Each encounter with James revealed a new layer like peeling an onion, except that instead of tears, what she found was an unexpected complexity that left her even more curious. The second date was her choice. Elena took him to a small, independent bookstore in the West Village, a place hidden between red brick buildings with an iron staircase that creaked underfoot and floor, to ceiling shelves stuffed with used books that smelled of old paper and forgotten stories. The owner, an elderly Italian man with white hair named Paolo, had known Elena since her college days. James observed everything with quiet attention. The way she ran her fingers along the spines of books, how her eyes sparkled when she found a hidden first edition, how she conversed with Paolo in broken Italian that he corrected with affectionate patience. When they left, James was carrying 3 books she'd recommended, one on Stoic philosophy, a Steinbeck novel, and a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. "Are you really going to read them?" Elena asked as they walked down the sidewalk, the afternoon sun creating elongated shadows between the buildings. "Of course," James replied, looking at her with that intensity that always made her heart race. "You chose them, so they matter." It was a simple phrase, but its weight stayed with Elena for days. The third date was his again. James took her to a pottery class at a studio in Brooklyn. Elena laughed when he suggested it, thinking it was a joke, but he was completely serious. They spent 2 hours with their hands covered in clay, trying to shape bowls that looked more like abstract disasters. James was surprisingly terrible at it, and seeing him frustrated, really frustrated, with his brow furrowed and a smudge of clay on his face, was the most human thing Elena had ever seen him do. "This is harder than it looks," he grumbled, looking at what should have been a bowl, but looked more like a crooked pancake. Elena laughed, the sound echoing through the studio. "Did you just admit something is difficult for you, James Whittaker? The man who built an empire?" He looked at her and then, to her surprise, he started laughing too. It was a real laugh, deep, that transformed his entire face and made something melt inside her chest. "Everyone has their limits," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Apparently, mine is clay art." They finished the class with 2 imperfect bowls that the instructor promised to fire in the kiln. When they left, James took Elena's hand to help her down the slippery entrance steps, and even after they reached the sidewalk, he didn't let go. She didn't pull her hand back. The following dates became a delicious and terrifying routine. Quiet dinners at hidden restaurants, walks along the High Line at dusk, a trip to a contemporary art gallery where Elena made sarcastic comments about incomprehensible installations, and James smiled more than she'd ever seen him smile. A bike ride through Central Park that ended with both of them laughing and breathless, sitting on the grass as the sun set. But it was during the 7th date, exactly 2 weeks after that first dinner in the park, that something changed for good. James had reserved a table at a small Italian restaurant on the Upper East Side, the kind of place that didn't have a website, just word of mouth, and where the owner treated all customers like family. They ate handmade pasta, drank red wine that warmed from within, and talked about everything: childhood, dreams, fears, regrets. It was there, between bites of carbonara and sips of Chianti, that James talked about Sophia. "I was engaged once," he said, turning the wine glass between his fingers, eyes fixed on the ruby liquid as if he could find answers there. 5 years ago, her name was Sophia Rossi, daughter of a media mogul. Beautiful, intelligent, perfect on paper. Elena felt something tighten in her chest, but kept her expression neutral. "What happened?" James took a deep breath as if gathering strength to continue. "I found out she was leaking confidential company information to her father. Deals we were closing. Investment strategies. She was using our relationship to benefit her family's business." He paused, finally raising his eyes to Elena. "When I confronted her, she didn't even deny it. Said I was naive to think love and business could be separated, that everything was a transaction in the end. The pain in his voice was palpable, even with his attempt to hide it under a layer of indifference. That's why the contract, Elena said quietly. That's why you wanted everything to be transparent from the start. James nodded. If it's going to be a transaction, let it be honest. No pretense that it's something else. Elena reached her hand across the table and hesitantly touched his. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt the warmth, the texture of skin, the small calluses she didn't expect to find on a CEO. Not everything has to be a transaction, James. He turned his palm up, interlacing his fingers with hers. The touch was simple but intimate, charged. With you, it's starting not to feel like one. Elena's heart beat faster. There was a vulnerability in his eyes now, something raw and unprotected that she'd never seen before. I have scars, too, she said, squeezing his hand lightly. I spent so much time taking care of my father, trying to fix what was broken, that I forgot to take care of myself. I gave up on dreams because it seemed selfish to pursue them when he was drowning. And when I realized it, I was drowning with him. James rubbed his thumb over her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her eyes sting. What dreams? Elena smiled sadly. Opening my own consulting firm, working with small businesses, helping them grow, not corporate giants, but real people trying to build something from scratch. She shrugged. It seemed impossible. Still dos. It's not. The certainty in his voice made her look at him. How can you be so sure? Because I saw you negotiate with me. I saw you fight for what you wanted without fear. I saw you turn an impossible situation into an opportunity. James leaned forward, their faces now close across the table. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Elena, and if there's anyone capable of doing the impossible, it's you. Tears threatened to form, but Elena blinked quickly, pushing them away. No one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever believed in her like this. Thank you, she whispered. They stayed like that for a long moment, hands intertwined, eyes fixed on each other, the rest of the restaurant disappearing around them. There was an electric current between them now, impossible to ignore. Desire mixed with something deeper, something that scared as much as it attracted. When they finally left the restaurant, the night was cold, with a breeze that brought the smell of distant rain. James took off his blazer and placed it over Elena's shoulders before she could protest. The fabric still held the warmth of his body, and she wrapped herself in it instinctively. They walked slowly through the lit streets, in no hurry to get anywhere. At some point, James's hand found hers again, and they walked with fingers intertwined in a comfortable silence that didn't need to be filled with words. When they reached the car, James turned to her, leaning slightly against the driver's door. The streetlights created soft shadows on his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the eyes that now seemed darker, more intense. Elena, he began, his voice. Yes. He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them until they were inches apart. Elena could feel the heat emanating from him, could see the struggle happening in his eyes. I didn't expect this, he said, raising a hand to touch her face. His fingers traced the line of her jaw with reverent delicacy. Didn't expect you to be this. This what? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Real, important, impossible to ignore. And then he leaned in, and Elena closed her eyes, feeling his breath mix with hers, his lips brushing against hers in a touch so soft it felt like a question. She answered by pressing against him, and the kiss deepened. It wasn't urgent or desperate. It was slow, exploratory, as if both were trying to memorize every sensation. His lips were warm and firm, moving against hers with a certainty that made her knees weak. His hands slid to the back of her neck, fingers threading through her hair, while the other pulled her waist, pressing their bodies together. Elena held his face, feeling the rough texture of stubble under her palms, the heat of his skin, the way he trembled slightly when she deepened the kiss. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. James rested his forehead against hers, eyes still closed. This complicates everything, he murmured. Elena smiled, even with her heart beating irregularly. I know. I don't care. Neither do I. They stayed like that for another moment, wrapped in the silence of the night and each other's warmth, knowing that something had changed irrevocably between them. When James finally took her home, he got out of the car and walked her to the building entrance. Before she went inside, he held her hand, bringing it to his lips and kissing her knuckles with a tenderness that made her heart melt. Good night, Elena. Good night, James. She climbed the stairs as if floating, the taste of him still on her lips, the warmth of him still on her skin, and for the first time in a long time, Elena allowed herself to feel hope, but in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered, What happens when he finds out who leaked the contract to the press? The headline appeared on a Tuesday morning like a silent bomb that explodes without warning. Elena was in the office James had arranged for her at Whitaker Industries, a spacious area on the 32nd floor, with a view of the Hudson and a glass desk where she worked on expansion strategies for the company's technology division. She had woken up still feeling the ghost of James's kiss on her lips, the warmth of his hands on her skin, the way he had whispered her name as if it were a prayer. But all of that vanished the moment she opened her news alert email. Billionaire James Whitaker, in controversial marriage agreement. Contract requires physical intimacy as clause. Her blood ran cold. With trembling hands, she clicked the link. The article was in the New York Tribune, one of the city's largest newspapers, and it wasn't just an article. It was a complete exposé, details of the original contract, her father's debt, Clause 7 that she had fought to remove, photographs of her and James together over the past week, leaving the Italian restaurant, walking hand in hand. The moment he kissed her on the street, every word was like a stab. Sources close to the matter reveal that Elena Hart, daughter of notorious gambler Robert Hart, accepted a marriage contract with the CEO of Whitaker Industries in exchange for forgiveness of a $3 million debt. The original contract included a controversial clause requiring physical intimacy before marriage, raising questions about consent and exploitation. Although the clause was supposedly renegotiated, the transactional nature of the relationship remains clear. Was Whitaker's empire built on equally questionable practices? Elena couldn't breathe. Her phone started ringing. First once, then again, then didn't stop. Messages flooded her inbox. Co-workers, college acquaintances, journalists asking for comments. Her heart pounded against her ribs, as if trying to escape her chest. The office door burst open, and James entered like a storm. He was holding a tablet. His face, a mask of controlled fury. But when his eyes met hers, there was something more. Pain, betrayal, disappointment. "You," he began, his voice dangerously low. "You did this." Elena stood up, her legs almost giving out beneath her. "What?" "No, James, I didn't. Don't lie to me." His voice thundered through the office. And she took a step back, shocked. Who else would know these details? Who else would have access to the original contract? "I didn't leak anything." Elena felt tears burn in her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "Why the hell would I do this? This destroys me as much as it destroys you." James threw the tablet onto the desk with a sharp sound that made Elena jump. "Maybe you decided you could make more from a lawsuit. Public exposure. Victimization. $1 million settlement. It's a brilliant plan, I'll admit." The words were like poison, burning everything they had built over the past weeks. "You really believe that?" Elena's voice trembled, but she kept her eyes fixed on him. "After everything, after the dates, the conversations. What happened between us?" James gave a bitter laugh without humor. "Clearly, I was wrong about you again." The reference to Sophia was like a slap in the face. Elena felt anger boil inside her, mixing with the pain. "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You're not going to compare me to her. I'm not your ex. I didn't betray you. And if you can't see that, if you're so stuck in the past that you can't trust anyone, then maybe you're right. Maybe this never should have happened." The silence that followed was deafening. They stood there, separated by only a few meters, but seeming to be in different worlds. James's face was rigid, his jaw locked, but there was something in his eyes, a crack in the armor, a flash of doubt. Before either could speak, Elena's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and her stomach sank even further. It was a number she knew very well. Her father. With trembling hands, she answered. "Hello, Elena, sweetheart. I'm sorry." Robert Hart's voice was drunk, slurred, but there was a desperation in it that made Elena's heart tighten. "I had no choice. They offered me $50,000. I needed the money. The debts, they don't stop." The world stopped. "You?" The word came out as a torn whisper. "You sold the story. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know it would be this bad. They said it was just a piece about you two. Nothing major." Elena hung up, her hand falling to her side. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The betrayal burned like acid in her veins. Her father, her own father, had done this. "Elena." James's voice came from far away as if she were underwater. She looked at him, and then, to her surprise, she started to laugh. An empty, broken laugh that hurt in her chest. "It was my father," she said, her voice strangely calm now. "He sold the story for $50,000. Less than you spend on a business meeting. That's the price of my dignity. apparently. James took a step toward her, his face softening. Elena, I don't. She raised her hand, stopping him. You already said what you think of me. You accused me, compared me to her. And you know what's worse? The tears finally escaped, running down her cheeks. I was starting to believe in you, in us, in something that could be real. But you were right from the beginning. Everything is a transaction, including this. She grabbed her purse and walked toward the door, passing him without looking back. Elena, wait. Don't follow me, she said, her voice firm now. Even through the tears, the contract is canceled. I'll pay the debt myself no matter how long it takes. I don't want anything from you. You don't have to do this. She turned at the door, looking at him one last time. His eyes were tormented, his face more vulnerable than she'd ever seen. But it was too late. The wound was already open, and she didn't know if it could ever heal. I do, because the only thing worse than being betrayed by my father would be staying here, knowing you'll never really trust me. She wiped the tears with the back of her hand. Goodbye, James. And then she left, letting the door close behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. Elena didn't remember how she got to the elevator, how she descended the 32 floors, how she left the building under camera flashes and reporters' shouts. Everything was a blur of sounds and images that didn't connect. She walked aimlessly through the streets of Manhattan, invisible among the crowd, until her feet took her to Brooklyn Bridge Park, the same place where it all began, where James had surprised her with food trucks and dancing and a tenderness she didn't know he was capable of showing. Elena sat on a bench facing the water, watching the sun, set behind the skyscrapers, painting everything golden and red. The tears kept falling, silent now, washing away all the hope she had allowed to grow. She had been betrayed twice, by the father who should have protected her, and by the man she was beginning to love but who couldn't trust her. And for the first time in her life, Elena Hart didn't know how to fix what was broken, because this time what was broken was herself. Her phone vibrated in her purse, a message. She hesitated but finally looked. It was from James, just 4 words. I was wrong. Forgive me. Elena looked at the message for a long time, her heart torn between anger and the desperate desire to believe that something could still be saved. But before she could respond, another message arrived, this time from an unknown number. When she opened it, her blood ran cold. A photo of her and James leaving the Italian restaurant with a caption that read, "This is just the beginning. The truth about Whitaker Industries hasn't come out yet. Stay tuned." Elena looked around, suddenly feeling exposed, watched, hunted. There was something bigger happening here, something beyond the contract, beyond the scandal, and she was right in the center of it. Elena spent 3 days locked in her apartment, ignoring the incessant calls, the messages flooding her phone, the knocks on the door from reporters who had somehow discovered her address. She resigned from Whitaker Industries by email. Cold, professional, final. There was no response. The apartment seemed smaller each day, the walls closing in around her as she replayed everything in her mind. Her father's betrayal, James's accusation, the threatening message she still didn't fully understand. Everything was a tangle of pain and confusion she couldn't unravel. On the night of the 3rd day, she finally went out. She needed air, needed space to breathe without feeling like she was suffocating. She put on sweatpants, an old Columbia hoodie, and a cap she pulled down low over her eyes. Nothing that would draw attention. She went down the stairs and out the back door of the building, avoiding the main entrance where a few persistent reporters were still camped out. The night was cold with a biting wind that brought the smell of distant rain. The streets were relatively empty, just a few hurried pedestrians and the distant sound of traffic. Elena walked with no particular destination, just wanting to move, to feel something beyond the numbness that had settled in her chest. She passed closed coffee shops, stores with dark windows, until her feet took her, inevitably back to the place where everything had changed, the service elevator of the building where her old office was located. She hadn't planned to go there, but there she was, standing in front of the building, looking at the lights still shining on some floors. Whitaker Tower was imposing against the night sky, a monolith of glass and steel that seemed as impenetrable as James himself. Elena was about to turn and leave when the main door opened, and there, coming out of the building, with his tie loose and his hair disheveled, was him. James Whitaker looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. There were dark shadows under his eyes, his stubble longer than usual, and something about his posture, normally so upright and confident, that seemed defeated. Their eyes met across the sidewalk, and Elena felt the air leave her lungs. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then James started walking toward her, his steps determined, but hesitant, as if he wasn't sure she wouldn't run away. "Elena," he said when he got close enough. His voice, "You came back." "I didn't come here for you," she said, crossing her arms defensively, even though it wasn't true. "I was just walking." James nodded slowly, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin tingle. "Can I walk with you?" She should say no, should turn and leave. But something about the way he looked at her, so vulnerable, so different from the cold, controlled man she'd met at the beginning, made her hesitate. "Why?" she asked, her voice harsher than intended. "To accuse me of something else." James closed his eyes as if the words were a physical blow. "No. To apologize." Again and again, as many times as it takes, Elena felt tears threaten, but blinked quickly, pushing them away. "Your apologies don't change what you said, what you thought of me." "I know." James took a step closer, and she could see the anguish in his eyes. "And I'll carry that for the rest of my life. But Elena, I need you to understand, when I saw that headline, when I read those details, all I could see was Sophia. It was betrayal again. And I panicked, so I pay for her mistakes." Elena's voice trembled. "Is that it?" "No, you don't deserve that. And I was an idiot for letting the past poison what we had." He ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. "But when I found out it was your father, Elena, I wanted to die because I realized that not only did I accuse you unjustly, but you were suffering twice from his betrayal and from mine." The words hurt because they were true. Elena looked away, unable to face the raw sincerity in his eyes. "It doesn't matter anymore," she said quietly. "It's all over anyway." "It's not." The certainty in his voice made her look at him again. "James, the scandal, the media, all of this. We can't just pretend it didn't happen." "I don't want to pretend." He took another step, now, so close she could feel his warmth, the familiar scent of cedar that haunted her dreams. "I want to fix it. Not the scandal. That'll pass. But us. I want to fix us." "There is no us," Elena said. But her voice came out too weak to be convincing. "There is, and you know it." James raised his hand, hesitant, and touched her face with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "You know there's something here, something real, something I've never felt before. And that terrifies me completely." Elena closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, even knowing she shouldn't. "You hurt me," she whispered. "I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for it if you'll let me." Before she could respond, the rain began to fall. First a few scattered drops, then an intense curtain that soaked them in seconds. Elena blinked, wiping water from her face, and James held her hand. "Come," he said, pulling her toward the building. "James, I can't, please. Just come talk to me out of the rain." She hesitated, but the cold of the rain and something deeper, the desperate desire to hear what he had to say, made her give in. They ran into the building, water dripping all over the marble floor. The night security guard looked at them with surprise, but James just waved. And the man nodded, discreetly looking the other way. James took her to the private elevator, the one that went directly to the executive floors. When the doors closed, the silence between them was dense, charged with everything that hadn't been said. Elena looked at him through the reflection of the polished steel doors. He was soaked, his white shirt clinging to his body, his hair dripping water on his forehead. But it was his eyes that held her, gray as a storm, fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart beat irregularly. The elevator rose slowly, and with each floor that passed, the tension grew. Elena could feel the heat emanating from him, even with the cold of wet clothes, could hear his breathing a little faster than normal. When the elevator stopped on the top floor and the doors opened, James didn't move immediately. Instead, he turned to her, and there was something in his face, a decision, a surrender. "Elena," he began, his voice low and hoarse. "I love you." The world stopped. "What?" The word came out as an incredulous whisper. "I love you." He took a step toward her, and Elena backed up until her back touched the elevator wall. "And I know I have no right to say this after what I did. I know I'm a coward for taking so long to realize it, but I can't pretend anymore. I can't hide behind contracts and logic and fears from the past." Tears began to fall down Elena's face, mixing with the rainwater. "James, don't do this." "I have to." He placed his hands on the wall on either side of her head, surrounding her without touching her. "Because these 3 days without you have been hell, because I wake up at night and reach for where you should be. Because when I read something interesting, my first thought is to tell you, because you made me feel alive in a way I didn't even know was possible." "You don't trust me," Elena said, her voice broken. "I do more than I trust myself. And that's what terrified me." James brought his face closer, his lips almost touching her forehead. "I was afraid of giving myself completely and being destroyed again. So I protected myself, attacked before I could be attacked. And I almost lost the only real thing I had. Elena sobbed, her hands gripping his shirt. I was scared too, she admitted. Scared that this was just a fantasy, that when reality hit, you'd realize I wasn't enough. James held her face with both hands, forcing her to look at him. You're everything. You're more than I deserve. And if you give me a chance, just one more, I'll spend every day proving that you can trust me. Elena looked into those gray eyes and saw the truth there, saw the fear, saw the hope, saw the love he was offering like a fragile and precious gift. I don't want a contract, she whispered. Neither do I. I want something real. So do I. I want you. James smiled. That devastating smile that transformed his entire face. Then have me. And then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft. It was desperate, urgent, as if both were trying to make up for all the lost days, all the unspoken words. His hands were in her hair, on her face, on her waist, pulling her against him, and Elena responded with the same intensity, fingers clutching his shirt, pulling him closer, deeper. The rainwater still dripped from them, creating small puddles on the elevator floor, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was the taste of him on her lips, the warmth of him against her body, the way he whispered her name between kisses like a prayer. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, foreheads resting against each other. I love you too, Elena said, the words coming out in a sigh. And it terrifies me. James laughed, the sound vibrating through his chest. Then let's be terrified together. And somehow that was perfect. But while they were there, lost in each other, neither of them saw the security camera in the elevator, blinking discreetly, recording everything. 2 weeks had passed since that night in the elevator, and the world between Elena and James had changed completely. There was no more contract, no more clauses or negotiations. Just them trying to build something real amid the wreckage of the scandal that still hadn't completely dissipated. The media continued circulating the story, but now with a different tone. After James gave a press conference where he publicly admitted he had fallen in love with Elena and that their relationship was genuine, not transactional, the focus began to shift. Some were still skeptical, but others began to see the story as a kind of modern, imperfect fairy tale. Elena returned to Whitaker Industries, but this time not as part of an agreement. James offered her the position of Director of Growth Strategy with real autonomy and an employment contract that she reviewed 3 times with Liam before signing. She wanted to make sure she was there on her own merit, not because she was involved with the CEO. During those 2 weeks, they spent all their free time together, quiet dinners at James's apartment, a penthouse on the Upper West Side with a view of Central Park, morning walks before work, conversations that stretched into the early hours, lying on the couch, fingers intertwined, sharing dreams and fears they'd never told anyone. But there was something they still hadn't shared. A physical intimacy beyond kisses, which were frequent and increasingly intense, but which both seemed to hesitate to cross, as if they were waiting for the right moment, as if they needed it to be perfect. On Friday night, James invited her to dinner at his apartment. He said he would cook, something she hadn't seen him do yet. Elena arrived at 8, wearing a simple navy blue silk dress that hugged her curves softly, her hair loose, falling in waves over her bare shoulders. When James opened the door, his gaze traveled over her body in a way that made every nerve ending in her body awaken. He wore dark jeans and a white linen shirt with the first few buttons open, revealing the line of his neck and the beginning of his chest. His hair was slightly messy, as if he'd run his hands through it several times, a nervous habit she'd learned to recognize. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice coming out huskier than normal. Elena smiled, feeling her cheeks warm. "And you're cooking?" "This I have to see." The apartment was lit by candles scattered throughout the living room and balcony. The dining table was set with elegant simplicity. White plates, crystal glasses, a bottle of red wine breathing at the center. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sparkled like a sea of earthly stars, and Central Park stretched out like a dark island amid the light. "I hope I don't disappoint you," James said, guiding her to the open kitchen. "I'm no chef, but I learned a few things from my grandmother." He had prepared a mushroom risotto that smelled of garlic, butter, and white wine. Fragrant and comforting. A simple green salad with lemon vinaigrette, and for dessert, there were fresh strawberries dipped in dark chocolate. They ate slowly, talking about everything and nothing. About the project Elena was developing at work, about the foundation James wanted to create to help children from vulnerable families inspired by her story, about books they'd read, places they wanted to visit, small details of everyday life that built intimacy more than grand gestures. But throughout the meal, there was an electric current in the air, an unspoken tension that grew with each prolonged glance, each accidental touch of hands when reaching for the wine. Each time, James's eyes dropped to her lips and lingered there for a second too long. When they finished eating, James extended his hand. "Come, I want to show you something." Elena placed her hand in his and let him guide her to the balcony. The night was warm with a gentle breeze that brought the scent of flowers from the park gardens below. The sky was surprisingly clear for New York, some stars fighting to be seen through the city lights. James pulled her close, arms wrapping around her waist from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. Elena leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the way his heart beat against her back. "What did you want to show me?" she asked, her voice soft. "This." He tightened the embrace slightly. "I wanted you to see the city the way I see it now. Different, more beautiful. Because you're here." Elena turned in his arms, facing him. Their faces were close, breaths mixing in the minimal space between them. She raised her hand and traced the line of his jaw, feeling the rough texture of the beard he kept short and trimmed. "James," she began, her heart beating hard. "I don't want to wait anymore." His eyes darkened, the gray becoming almost black in the candlelight. "Are you sure?" His voice was tense, controlled, but she could feel the contained tremor in him. "Because when it happens, Elena, it won't be because of a contract or an obligation. It'll be because I want you. Only you. And I don't know if I'll be able to let you go after. I don't want you to let me go." She brought her face closer, her lips brushing his. "I want you completely, not out of obligation. By choice." That was all he needed to hear. James kissed her with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. His hands slid down her arms over her shoulders until they found the zipper at the back of her dress. He stopped, pulling away just enough to look into her eyes. "Tell me if you want to stop. At any time." "I won't want to stop," Elena whispered. He pulled the zipper slowly, his fingers tracing the line of her spine as the dress opened. The silk slid over her shoulders, falling in a blue pool at her feet. Elena stood there wearing only black lace lingerie, vulnerable but not ashamed, while James's eyes traveled over every inch of her with a reverence that made her skin tingle. "You're perfect," he said, his voice rough with desire. Elena reached for his shirt buttons, unbuttoning them one by one with slightly trembling fingers. When she opened the shirt and slid her hands over his shoulders, feeling the warm skin and firm muscles under her palms, she heard his breath catch. James picked her up, literally lifted her as if she weighed nothing, and carried her inside through the living room to the bedroom. The bed was huge, covered with white sheets that looked like a cloud. He laid her down carefully as if she was something precious, and then hovered over her supported on his arms, just looking. "What?" Elena asked, her heart pounding, just trying to memorize this moment. "You. The way you're looking at me right now." Elena pulled him down, eliminating the space between them. Their bodies fit together as if they'd been made for this, curves and angles meeting perfectly. His hands explored, fingers tracing patterns on her skin that made her tremble. She arched against him when his lips found her neck, then the curve of her shoulder, then lower. "James," she gasped when he unhooked her bra with a skilled hand. "Please." "Please what?" he murmured against her skin, clearly enjoying every second, every touch. "Don't make me beg." He raised his head, meeting her eyes, a lazy smile on his lips. "But I like hearing you talk like that." Elena pulled him into a deep kiss, her hands sliding down his waist, opening his belt, the button of his pants. She felt his body tense, heard the low groan he couldn't hold back. "Elena," his voice was a warning, or maybe a plea. "I like hearing you talk like that too," she whispered against his lips. What followed was a dance of skin against skin, intertwined breaths, whispers of names and promises. James was gentle but intense, each touch deliberate, each kiss deepened. He explored her as if discovering sacred territory, attentive to every sigh, every tremor, every sign that he was doing something she liked. And when they finally came together, it was with a connection that went beyond the physical. Elena looked into his eyes, those gray eyes that had been so cold at the beginning, but now burned with something fierce and true, and saw everything he felt reflected there. Love, desire, vulnerability, fear of losing her. Promised to stay, they moved together, finding a rhythm that was only theirs, building something that grew and grew until they both reached climax, clinging to each other, as if they were the only solid thing in a world spinning too fast. Afterward, lying intertwined, their breathing still rapid, James traced lazy circles on Elena's bare back. She was nestled against his chest, her head resting where she could hear his heart beating, strong and steady. "I didn't expect this," she said, her voice sleepy. "What? That you'd be like this? So attentive, so present." James kissed the top of her head, I didn't expect it either, but you transformed me, made me want to be better. Elena raised her head to look at him. You don't need to be different. I want you exactly as you are. He held her face, his thumb caressing her cheek. And I don't want to let you go ever. Then don't. And there, in that perfect and fragile moment, wrapped in each other in the silence of the night, they both knew something had changed irrevocably. There was no going back. There was no fear greater than what they felt. There was only them. And for now that was enough. But while they slept, lulled by each other's breathing, neither of them knew that the threatening message Elena had received weeks ago was just the beginning. Someone was watching, waiting, planning, and the storm that was coming would be bigger than anything they'd faced so far. Monday started with an illusion of normalcy. Elena woke up in James's arms, sunlight filtering through the translucent bedroom curtains, creating golden patterns on his skin. She watched his face relaxed in sleep. The tension lines that normally marked his forehead were softened, his lips slightly parted. A vulnerability he rarely showed when awake. She didn't want to move, didn't want to break that perfect moment. But reality had other plans. James's phone rang on the nightstand. Not the soft ringtone he used for alarms, but the shrill tone reserved for emergencies. He woke instantly, all the softness of sleep disappearing as he reached for the phone. Whitaker, he answered, his voice already in executive mode. Elena watched his face change, the color drain, his jaw tighten. Something was wrong, very wrong. He hung up and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, his back tense, his head down. James. Elena sat up, pulling the sheet against her chest. What happened? He turned, and the expression on his face made her stomach sink. There's a video from the elevator that night. Elena's blood ran cold. What? Someone hacked the security cameras and leaked the footage of us in the elevator. His voice was controlled, but she could see the anger boiling beneath the surface. It's everywhere. News sites, social media. It went viral in the last 2 hours. Elena felt the world spin. She remembered that night, the intensity, the vulnerability, the words of love spoken between desperate kisses, and now all of that was exposed, public for anyone to see and judge. No, she whispered, her hands trembling. No, no, no. James moved quickly, returning to the bed and pulling her against him. Hey, breathe. It's okay. We'll fix this. How? Her voice came out strained. How are we going to fix this, James? Our intimacy, our most vulnerable moment is everywhere. I know. And I'm going to find out who did this. And I'm going to destroy them. The promise in his voice was dark, dangerous. But before they could say anything else, Elena's phone started ringing, too. And it didn't stop. The next few hours were a waking nightmare. James's legal team worked frantically to take the video down, but it was like trying to hold water in your hands. For every site that removed it, it appeared on 5 others. The media was in a frenzy. Commentators debated privacy versus public interest. Some defended them, saying they were victims of a cruel invasion. Others criticized them, saying they'd chosen to live in the spotlight. Elena tried to go to work, but there were reporters camped at the entrance to Whitaker Tower, cameras in their faces. Questions shouted. She managed to get in through the garage, but when she arrived at the office, everything felt wrong. Colleagues looked at her with pity or curiosity. Some avoided her gaze completely. She locked herself in the office and tried to work, but couldn't concentrate. Every notification on her phone was another article, another comment, another invasion. She felt the walls closing in again, that suffocating feeling she'd felt after the first scandal returning with full force. Around noon, Liam called. Elena, you need to get out of there, he said without preamble. The situation is getting ugly. There are protests forming in front of the building. Some privacy groups, some religious groups. It's turning into a circus. I can't run away again, Elena said, but her voice came out weak. It's not running. It's protecting yourself. Please. She hung up and stared out the window. Below, she could see the crowd growing, signs being raised, people shouting. Everything felt surreal, as if it were happening to someone else. The office door opened, and James entered. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since morning. There was a tension in his shoulders she'd never seen. And his eyes, normally so controlled, were stormy. We need to talk, he said, closing the door behind him. Elena turned to him, and something in his tone made her heart race. About what? James hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Elena saw something that terrified her. Doubt. The board is pressuring. They think the scandal is affecting the company. The stock dropped 3% just today. Investors are nervous, and Elena crossed her arms, already knowing where this was going. They want me to distance myself from you publicly, to control the damage. The words felt like bombs in the space between them. Elena felt something break inside her chest, something she didn't know was so fragile. "And you?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "What do you want?" "I want you. I'll always want you." He took a step toward her. "But I also have responsibilities. Thousands of people depend on this company, their families, their livelihoods. So, what are you saying?" Elena felt tears burn, but refused to let them fall. "That you're going to choose the company?" "No." James ran his hands through his hair, frustrated. "I'm saying I'm trapped, that no matter what I do, someone's going to get hurt, and I don't know how to fix this." Elena looked at him, really looked and saw the man she loved being torn apart between duty and desire. Saw the crushing weight of impossible choices and something inside her, something strong and resilient that had been forged through years of dealing with her father's chaos, solidified. "Then I'll make it easy for you," she said, her voice firm now. "Elena, don't. I resign today." Now, she was already grabbing her purse, moving with deliberate purpose. "I'll leave the company. I'll give a statement saying our relationship was an error in judgment. I'll take all the blame." James grabbed her arm, turning her to him. "You're not doing that. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me. It's not for you." Her voice echoed through the office. "It's for me because I can't live like this anymore, James. Being watched, judged, having every intimate moment turned into a public spectacle. I can't. Then we face it together. Like you said, love requires trust. So trust me. Trust that we'll get through this." Elena looked into his eyes and saw the sincerity there. But she also saw the fear, the same fear she felt. "What if we can't?" she whispered. "What if this destroys us?" James pulled her against him, holding her tightly as if he could keep her safe through sheer force of will. "Then we'll be destroyed together. But I'm not giving up on you. Not without a fight." They stayed like that for a long moment, clinging to each other amid the chaos, and Elena realized something. She was tired of fighting, tired of being strong, tired of having to prove her worth all the time. But when she looked at James, she saw that he was just as tired as she was. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to be weak together, to admit they needed help. "I don't want to do this alone," she said against his chest. "You're not alone. Never again." And there in that office that suddenly seemed too small for all their fears, Elena made a decision. She wasn't going to run, wasn't going to hide, wasn't going to let whoever was trying to destroy them win. "All right," she said, pulling back to look at him. "Then, let's do this your way, but not with half measures. No apologies. No trying to please the board or the investors or the media." James raised an eyebrow. "What are you proposing?" "Truth, total and brutal. Let's give an interview together, and let's tell our story. All of it. The contract, the mistakes, how we fell in love despite everything. And let's let people decide. If that's not enough, at least we tried." A slow smile formed on James's face. The first genuine smile of the day. "You're incredible. You know that?" "I do." Elena smiled back, and for a moment, the weight seemed lighter. "So, what do you say? Let's do this." James pulled her into a kiss, quick but intense. A sealed promise. Let's do this. But as they made plans, neither of them noticed the figure watching from a black car across the street, a figure that smiled seeing the couple through the office window. The game wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. The interview aired on a Thursday night during prime time, on one of the most watched news programs in the country. The journalist chosen was Victoria Lane, a woman known for her integrity and for asking tough but fair questions. James insisted on someone who wouldn't treat them with kid gloves, and Elena agreed if they were going to do this, it had to be real. They sat side by side on a simple couch, without the excessive glamour of a television set. The setting was neutral, just them, Victoria, and the truth. James wore a dark suit without a tie, the shirt open at the collar, and Elena chose an elegant but understated gray dress. They weren't trying to impress. They were trying to connect. The first questions were predictable. How they met. Why the contract. Victoria didn't spare uncomfortable details, and they didn't run from them. James admitted he had proposed the agreement coldly and calculatedly, that he hadn't considered Elena's feelings at the beginning. Elena admitted she accepted, partly out of desperation, but also out of pride. She wanted to prove she could negotiate as an equal with someone like him. "But something changed," Victoria said, leaning slightly forward. "When did you realize it was more than an agreement?" Elena and James exchanged a look. It was Elena who answered first. "I think it was on the first real date. He took me to food trucks at Brooklyn Bridge Park." She smiled at the memory. "I expected expensive restaurants and ostentation. Instead, he gave me something simple and true. And I realized there was a real person beneath that corporate facade. Someone I wanted to know." James took her hand, interlacing their fingers. For me, it was when she challenged me, when she refused my terms and demanded her own. No one had ever done that, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't just smart and beautiful. She was brave, authentic, and I couldn't stop thinking about her. Victoria watched them for a moment, then asked the question everyone was waiting for. But do you understand that the way you started, a contract, a transaction, taints what came after? People are questioning whether your love is real or just a narrative constructed for damage control. The silence that followed was heavy. Elena felt the tension in James's hand, but he didn't let go. Instead, he turned to the camera, to all the people watching on the other side, and spoke with a raw vulnerability she'd never seen him display publicly. I understand why people doubt. I would doubt, too. It took a deep breath, but I can't control what others think. I can only tell the truth. And the truth is that I tried to keep this as business, tried not to feel, and I failed completely. He looked at Elena. Because she made me want to be more than just a CEO, she made me want to be a man who deserved to be loved. Tears burned in Elena's eyes. But she didn't hold them back this time. She let them fall freely as she squeezed his hand. And I learned that love isn't something you can plan or control, she added, looking at Victoria. But speaking to the world, sometimes it comes in the strangest and most imperfect ways, and you can reject it because it doesn't fit some romantic ideal, or you can embrace it with all its flaws and complications, and build something real from it. The interview continued for another 40 minutes. They talked about the video leak, the violation, the pain, the way it made them question everything. James announced he was suing all the sites that refused to remove the content, and that he would create a foundation to support victims of privacy invasion. Elena talked about her plans to launch her own consulting firm, something James was supporting financially, but that would be completely hers. And at the end, Victoria asked the final question, "So, what comes now for you two?" James and Elena looked at each other, and something passed between them. A silent understanding, an unspoken promise, living, Elena said simply, without contracts, without clauses, just living. The reaction was immediate and divided. Some loved the honesty, others remained skeptical. But something changed. The narrative began to shift from scandal to unlikely love story, and slowly, the media frenzy began to subside. 2 weeks later, James discovered who was behind the leaks. It wasn't through private investigators or sophisticated technology. It was through an anonymous call to his lawyer. The culprit was Ethan Rossi, Sophia's brother, his ex-fiancée. He had planned everything as revenge for the breakup, hiring hackers to access the security cameras and paying informants to leak details of the contract. He wanted to destroy James in the most public and humiliating way possible. James could have destroyed him, could have sued, ruined him, but when he discussed it with Elena, she convinced him to do something different. "Let it go," she said, sitting on the couch in his apartment with a cup of tea in her hands. "He's already lost, because while he was trying to destroy us, we were building something real. Suing will only drag this out for months, and I don't want to live in the past anymore." James studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. Let's let it go." And they did. Instead of revenge, James channeled his energy into the foundation he'd promised to create. They called it Project Resilience, dedicated to supporting children and young adults from families affected by addiction, offering scholarships, mentorship, and psychological support. Elena launched her consulting firm, Heart Strategy Group, and the first client was, ironically, a startup that Whitaker Industries had invested in. She worked tirelessly, building a reputation based on results, not connections. And James, true to his word, kept his professional distance, even as he watched from afar with pride. 3 months after the interview, on a quiet autumn night, James took Elena back to Brooklyn Bridge Park, to the same place where they'd had their first date. He had reserved the space discreetly without fanfare, and when they arrived, there were lights hanging between the trees, creating a canopy of artificial stars. A small string orchestra played softly in the corner, and in the center, there was a simple table with 2 chairs decorated with candles and white lilies. "What is all this?" Elena asked, her eyes wide. James smiled. That soft smile she'd learned to love. A new beginning? No cameras, no scandals, just us. They dined under the stars. Simple food from food trucks that James had sent for the same tacos they'd shared months ago. And afterward, when the music changed to something slower, he pulled her to dance. It was there, as they moved together under the lights, that James stopped. He pulled back slightly, holding both her hands, and Elena saw something in his eyes that made her heart race. "Elena Hart," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "When we met, I offered you a contract, clauses, terms, A cold transaction. And you taught me that love doesn't work like that, that the best things in life can't be negotiated or controlled. They can only be chosen every day. He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small paper envelope, not a ring box, an envelope. So today, I'm not offering you a contract, I'm offering you a promise. He opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, handwritten. I wrote this last night. It's just one page, and it has only one clause. Elena took the paper with trembling hands and read, I, James Whitaker, promise to love you, Elena Hart. Trust you and choose you every day on the easy days and the hard ones. When the lights are on us and when we're alone in the darkness, I promise not to try to control or plan our future, but to build it with you, one day at a time. This is my only clause, my only certainty. You. Tears streamed freely down Elena's face as she looked from the paper to James, and then she saw he was kneeling. In one hand, a velvet box with a simple but stunning ring, a blue sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. Will you marry me? He asked, his voice, not because of a contract, not out of obligation, but because I can't imagine my life without you. Elena let out a laugh broken by tears and joy, pulling him up and throwing her arms around his neck. Yes, yes, 1,000 times. Yes. James spun her in the air, laughing, a pure and free sound she rarely heard. When he set her back down, he slid the ring onto her finger, then kissed her with all the promise of a future built not on contracts, but on choice. Around them, the orchestra played louder, and for the first time in months, everything felt right, perfect, real. 18 months later, morning sunlight filtered through the white sheer curtains of the farmhouse James and Elena had bought in upstate New York, far enough from the city to have peace, but close enough that James could go to the office when necessary. The 5-acre property was rustic, but elegant, with a renovated main house that mixed old charm with modern comfort surrounded by gardens that Elena was slowly transforming into her own sanctuary. It was a spring Saturday, and the air was fragrant with lilacs and freshly cut grass. In the backyard, under a pergola intertwined with purple wisteria and delicate LED lights, white chairs were arranged in intimate rows. No more than 50 people, close friends, chosen family, and some colleagues who had become true confidants over the years. Elena was in an upstairs room looking at herself in the mirror. Her wedding dress was simple, ivory silk that flowed in clean lines without embroidery or excess. Just the elegance of simplicity. Her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders with small white flowers woven through. She wore no veil. She didn't need to hide anything. You look beautiful, Liam said, standing behind her, adjusting his own tie. He would be the one to walk her down the aisle. The choice had been easy. He'd been by her side through all the difficult moments. I'm nervous, Elena admitted, smiling at his reflection. Good kind of nervous, the best kind. A soft knock on the door. Then it opened. Robert Hart entered, hesitant, wearing a simple suit that was clearly new. He'd been sober for 14 months, the longest period since Elena could remember. There was therapy, support meetings, and more than anything, there was the determination to fix what had been broken. Their relationship was still fragile. There were still wounds that hadn't completely healed, but Elena had learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing to move forward without carrying the weight of the past like an anchor. You look. Robert's voice failed, and he cleared his throat. You look radiant, sweetheart. Thank you, Dad. Elena turned and took a few steps toward him. Thank you for being here and for being present. Really present. He nodded, his eyes misting. There's nowhere I'd rather be. And Elena? He hesitated, then continued with a tight voice. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I failed you in every possible way, but I want you to know I'm proud, immensely proud of the woman you've become despite me. Elena felt tears threaten, but blinked quickly. She didn't want to smudge her makeup. Instead, she hugged her father. Not a long embrace, but genuine. I know, Dad. I know. Downstairs, James stood under the pergola, hands in his pockets, trying to control the nerves that assailed him. He wore a light gray suit without a tie, the white shirt open at the collar, his hair casually combed back. Beside him was Ethan, his best friend since college, serving as best man. You're shaking, Ethan observed, smiling. I'm terrified, James admitted, laughing softly. What if she realizes she can do so much better? Man, she already knows that. And she's still here. Ethan patted his shoulder. Relax. She chose you every day. The music began, a soft acoustic version of a song Elena loved played by a string quartet. The guests stood, and then James saw her. Elena walked down the grass aisle, Liam on one side and her father on the other, both accompanying her. both important in her journey, but James's eyes were fixed only on her. On the way, the sun illuminated her hair. On the way, her smile widened when their eyes met. On the way, she seemed to float toward him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When she reached the altar, both Liam and Robert kissed her cheek and stepped back, leaving her alone with James. He took her hands, squeezing lightly, and Elena could feel the slight tremor in them. "Hi," she whispered, smiling. "Hi," he replied, his eyes shining. "You're perfect." The ceremony was simple. There were no elaborate speeches or complicated rituals, just vows, words they had written themselves, promises made not to a crowd, but to each other. James went first. "Elena, you entered my life like a storm," he began, his voice firm but emotional. "You destroyed all my defenses, questioned all my certainties, and forced me to feel things I was sure I'd buried. You taught me that control is an illusion, that vulnerability isn't weakness, that loving someone means choosing her every day, even when, especially when it's scary. So today, in front of everyone we love, I choose you forever." Elena was crying now, not even trying to hide it. She wiped her tears and took a deep breath before beginning. "James, when we met, you offered me a contract, and I learned something important. You can't contract love. You can't negotiate it or define it in terms, but you can cultivate it. You can nurture it. You can wake up every day and choose to keep building something together, even when it's hard. You gave me space to be strong and permission to be weak. You made me believe I deserved to be loved, not despite my flaws, but including them. So today I choose you today, and every day to come." When the officiant declared them husband and wife and James kissed her under the applause and tears of the guests, Elena felt that everything, every scandal, every pain, every moment of doubt had been worth it to get here. The reception was intimate and joyful. Long tables with white tablecloths, decorated with wild flowers and candles, homemade food, wine, laughter. James danced with Elena under the same lights that shone in the pergola, and this time there were no cameras, no judging eyes, just people who loved them, celebrating their love. During dinner, James made an announcement. "Elena and I wanted to share something with you," he said, standing with a champagne glass in hand, his other arm around her waist. "A few months ago, we decided we wanted to expand our family, and recently we were approved for adoption." A murmur of surprise and joy rippled through the guests. Elena continued, her voice emotional. "We're adopting 2 siblings, Nora, 7 years old, and Owen, 5. They lost their parents in an accident 2 years ago and have been in the system since then. And when we met them," she looked at James, who squeezed her hand. "We knew they were ours." The applause was deafening, and when the guests raised their glasses in a toast, Elena and James looked at each other, knowing they were about to embark on the greatest adventure of their lives. 6 months later, the farmhouse was noisy in a wonderful way. Nora ran through the garden chasing butterflies, her laughter echoing through the air. Owen was with James, the two of them building a treehouse that had become their weekend project. Elena watched from the porch, one hand unconsciously resting on her slightly rounded belly. The pregnancy had been a surprise, an unexpected blessing 4 months after Nora and Owen had arrived. At first, Elena was worried that the children would feel replaced, worried that she wouldn't be able to love them all equally. But Nora, when she found out, had placed her hand on Elena's belly with wide eyes of wonder and said, "I'm going to be a real big sister. I'll protect the baby. I promise." And Owen had asked if he could help choose the name, and then suggested Dragon, because dragons are cool. Now, watching her family chosen, built, loved, Elena felt a peace she never imagined possible. James climbed the porch steps, sweat on his forehead, sawdust in his hair, but grinning from ear to ear. "The treehouse is going to be amazing," he said, kissing her temple. "Owen has very specific ideas about where the defense gates should go." Elena laughed, leaning against him. "You're a wonderful father, you know that." James looked at her, and there was so much love in his eyes that she felt her chest tighten. "I only learned from the best." He placed his hand over hers on her belly, and together they watched Nora and Owen play, 2 children who had arrived with broken hearts, and who now laughed freely, secure in the love that surrounded them. "You surrendered after all," James teased softly, repeating the words he'd said so long ago. Elena turned to look at him, a smile playing on her lips. "I didn't surrender. I chose, and I keep choosing. Every day." James pulled her into a slow, sweet kiss, and there, in that perfect and imperfect moment, with children laughing in the garden and a baby growing inside her, Elena knew the truth. No contract could have predicted this. No clause could have guaranteed this, because the best things in life, love, family, belonging, don't come from signed agreements. They come from choices made every day, with open hearts and intertwined hands. And this choice, this life they had built together, was better than any fantasy she could have imagined.